Three young girls, ages 8, 10, and 12, excited for their trip, settled into their first-class seats. Their matching dresses were crisp, their laughter light. But to one flight attendant, something didn't look right. Her years of experience told her who belonged in first class and who didn't, and in her mind, these girls did not. She made a decision that would change everything, a decision she would soon regret. What happens when bias meets the unexpected? When a moment of quiet prejudice collides with immense power? This is a gripping story of mistaken judgment, accountability, and a reckoning that extends far beyond a single flight. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you believe in justice and love stories that challenge perspectives, don't forget to like, share and subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking stories. Your support helps us bring these important narratives to a wider audience. Now, let's get into it. Carolyn Carol Davis had always prided herself on her work. With over 20 years of experience as a flight attendant, she had mastered the unwritten rules of first-class travel. Carol knew, almost instinctively, who belonged in first class and who didn't. It wasn't just about the price of the ticket. First class was a world of unwritten etiquette, of hushed voices and pressed suits, of deference and belonging. That's why, the moment she spotted them, she knew something was off. Three young black girls, ages 8, 10 and 12, dressed in matching pink dresses, their hair neatly braided, sat quietly in the plush leather seats. They weren't causing a fuss, weren't being disruptive, but Carol's instincts flared nonetheless. She approached, forcing a polite smile. "Good afternoon, girls. May I see your tickets, please?" The middle girl, slightly taller than the other two, looked up with wide brown eyes. "Our daddy has them," she said softly. Carol's smile tightened. She had seen this before. Families trying to sneak into first class, thinking the flight attendants wouldn't notice. Of course, they had to be discreet about it, but this was a little brazen. She crouched slightly, keeping her voice light. "I see. Well, first class is reserved for passengers with assigned seating. I just need to make sure you're in the right place." The girl on the right, her hands folded neatly in her lap, frowned. "We are." "Daddy said so." Carol exhaled slowly, straightening up. She had dealt with entitled passengers before, but usually they were adults who argued about upgrades. She didn't want to make a scene, but she also had a job to do. "I'll need to speak with your father," she said, her tone leaving no room for discussion. A quiet cough from behind her made Carol turn. A man had stood up from one of the back rows of first class, tall and impeccably dressed in a charcoal grey suit. Their father, Charlie Anderson, intervened. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace. His deep brown eyes held a quiet authority, and as he approached, the passengers around them instinctively took notice. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice smooth and calm, yet carrying an unmistakable weight. Carol's well-trained customer service facade remained in place, but something in her gut twisted. "I just need to confirm their seating arrangements," she said briskly. The man glanced at the three girls and then at Carol, his expression unreadable. "They're exactly where they're supposed to be." Carol nodded, maintaining her professional demeanor. "I understand, sir, but I need to verify." "You need to verify that three well-dressed, well-behaved little girls belong in first class?" The way he said it, quiet but firm, sent a ripple of tension through the nearby passengers. Carol stiffened. "Sir, I have to follow procedure. If you could just provide their boarding passes." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and retrieved 3 crisp boarding passes, handing them to her without another word. She took them, scanning the details. Her stomach sank with each perfectly legitimate first-class assignment. There was no mistake, no fraud, no misunderstanding. She had misjudged. Carol swallowed hard and forced a smile. "Thank you, sir. Enjoy your flight." She turned quickly, moving away before the heat of embarrassment could fully settle in her chest. As she walked back toward the galley, she could feel the weight of the man's gaze on her back, and worse, the shifting glances of the surrounding passengers. Her pulse quickened. Reaching the flight attendant station, she exhaled sharply, willing the moment to pass, to dissolve into just another routine interaction. But before she could fully compose herself, the intercom crackled to life. "Miss Davis, report to the front cabin immediately." Her breath caught. That was the captain's voice. Carol straightened her uniform and hurried toward the cockpit, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. When she arrived, the captain was waiting, his expression unreadable. Standing beside him was a senior airline representative. Carol's posture stiffened with authority. "Miss Davis," the representative said, her voice cool and clipped, "please step off the aircraft." The words hit Carol like a physical blow. "Excuse me." The representative didn't blink. "We've received a formal complaint from Mr. Anderson. Your actions were deemed inappropriate, and given the high-profile nature of this situation, corporate has decided to remove you from this flight immediately." Carol's mouth went dry. "But this is not up for discussion." Carol glanced toward the front of the cabin, where Charlie Anderson now stood near his daughters, watching the exchange with the same measured calm as before. The weight of what was happening finally crashed down on her. She was being removed, right here, right now. Passengers whispered, a few lifting their phones, capturing the moment. Her face burned as she walked past them, her steps stiff and mechanical. Numbly, she reached for her bag, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. As she walked down the jet bridge, the realization settled in, heavy and final. By the time the plane landed, the world would already know what happened here today. Carol Davis sat in her small, dimly lit living room, staring blankly at the television screen. The news anchor's voice was calm, almost detached, as she narrated the scene playing out behind her. Grainy cell phone video taken from inside the first-class cabin of Flight 227. 3 young black girls, daughters of billionaire airline executive Charles Anderson, were asked to leave their seats in first class. The incident went viral, and the backlash began. The video, which had been shared millions of times, sparked outrage across the country, with many calling for accountability in the airline industry. Carol's stomach twisted as she watched herself on the screen, her expression frozen in a moment of forced politeness. The video didn't capture her hesitation, her internal deliberation, the brief flicker of doubt that had crossed her mind before she spoke. It only captured the decision, the moment she had questioned their presence. The news anchor continued. In response to the public outcry, the airline has released a statement confirming that the employee in question, Carol Davis, has been terminated. The airline has also stated that they are committed to reviewing their training programs to ensure an inclusive and unbiased experience for all passengers. Carol flinched at the word terminated. It was official. It had been official since the moment she was pulled from that plane, but seeing it on national television made it real in a way that the hurried HR email she received earlier that morning had not. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, another unknown number. She let it ring. It had been doing that all day, ringing, vibrating, flashing with missed calls and unread messages. Some were from journalists, some from people she hadn't spoken to in years, and some from complete strangers who had seen the video and decided she deserved to hear exactly what they thought of her. She had made the mistake of checking social media once, just once. Racist hag, deserves to be blacklisted from the entire airline industry, fire her, she should be arrested. This is what happens when people abuse their little bit of power. Carol had closed the app immediately, her hands shaking so badly she had nearly dropped her phone. Now, she stared at it warily, as if it might attack. A knock at the door made her jump. She hesitated before standing, peering through the peephole. A man in a dark suit stood outside, his hands clasped in front of him. She hesitated, debating whether to ignore it, but something about the way he carried himself, calm, deliberate, unshaken by the chaos swirling around her, made her open the door. "Miss Davis," he said smoothly, offering a tight smile. "I'm Richard O'Connor. I'm an attorney, and I think I can help you." Carol folded her arms across her chest, wary. "Help me?" Richard nodded. "The airline threw you to the wolves, Miss Davis. They fired you without a hearing, let you become the face of this controversy, and are now pretending they had no part in what happened. Meanwhile, your entire career is in shambles, and no one is stopping to ask whether you actually deserve this level of backlash." Carol swallowed hard. The lawsuit against the airline began. "Fired flight attendant sues billionaire CEO and airline," scrolled across the bottom of CNN. Twitter erupted in debate. Some called her desperate, others brave. Some accused her of weaponizing the legal system, of refusing to take accountability. Others pointed out that the airline had used her as a human shield, firing her to deflect attention from their own policies. Anderson's camp released a statement within hours. It was short, clipped, devoid of emotion. "Mr. Anderson believes this lawsuit is a distraction from the larger conversation about racial bias in the airline industry. He will not be deterred from pushing for meaningful change." Carol read it over 3 times, searching for a sign of weakness. There wasn't one. It was calculated, precise. It positioned him as the bigger man, the one fighting for justice, while she flailed in desperation. Richard wasn't concerned. "He's playing the long game," he said. "We don't let him. We hit hard, fast, and we make sure the public sees the cracks in his armor." The cracks came a few days later. A former colleague of Carol's, Lisa Gentry, came forward in a televised interview claiming that she had witnessed Carol display similar behavior toward black passengers in the past. "I don't think she meant harm," Lisa said, choosing her words carefully. "But there was a pattern, a lot of little moments, small things. She always seemed suspicious of black passengers in first class. It wasn't explicit, but it was there." Carol sat frozen as she watched, feeling her stomach drop. Richard turned off the TV with a sigh, rubbing his temples. "Well, that's inconvenient." Carol's voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't, I know," Richard cut in. "But perception is everything, and right now the perception is that you have a history of this." Carol pressed her hands to her face, willing herself to breathe. It was happening all over again, the rush of judgment, the tidal wave of scrutiny. This time it wasn't just the internet, it was real, tangible. Richard watched her carefully. "We can get ahead of this," he said, "but we need to be smart." Carol had spent the past 24 hours watching her life unravel at an alarming speed. She had been on that plane, then suddenly she wasn't. She had had a job, and then suddenly she didn't. Now she was a trending topic, a name people spat out with venom. She exhaled sharply. "What exactly are you offering?" Richard's eyes were sharp and calculating. "A lawsuit, wrongful termination, defamation. We take this to court. We make the airline answer for how they handled this. More importantly, we make sure you aren't the only one paying the price for what happened." Carol stiffened. The idea of fighting back had never even occurred to her. She had been so consumed by the weight of what was happening, by the sheer force of public outrage, that she hadn't considered whether she had any options left. Richard took her silence as encouragement. "I've handled cases like this before. The media is fickle, Miss Davis. They love a villain, but they love a redemption arc even more. Right now, you're the villain of this story, but that can change." Carol bit her lip, glancing past him toward the street. A car sat idling at the curb, a camera crew inside. They were waiting for her to emerge, for another shot they could spin into another headline. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. Maybe it was time to give them a different story. Carol sat across from Richard O'Connor in his sleek, modern office. The floor-to-ceiling windows behind him offered a panoramic view of the city skyline. The morning light cast long shadows across the polished mahogany desk, but Carol barely noticed. Her hands gripped the armrests of her chair, knuckles white, as Richard leaned forward, his sharp blue eyes locked onto hers. "This isn't just about your job," he said, his voice measured and confident. "This is about setting the record straight." Carol had spent the past 3 days drowning in public outrage. The news cycle hadn't moved on. If anything, it had grown more vicious. Headlines dissected her every move, from grainy photos of her leaving her apartment to deep dives into her past employment records. The internet had decided she was a racist, a disgrace, a woman who had used her tiny bit of authority to humiliate 3 innocent black children. She had tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. The weight of it pressed down on her, suffocating and inescapable. "The airline fired you without due process," Richard continued, tapping his pen against the desk. "They made you the scapegoat, hoping the outrage would die down if they tossed you aside. But it hasn't, and it won't. Not until you fight back." Carol swallowed, her throat dry. "Fight back? How?" "We sue." The word hit her like a slap. "Sue who?" "Charlie Anderson, the airline." Richard leaned back, hands steepled. "Wrongful termination, defamation, emotional distress. We make it clear that you weren't just fired, you were publicly executed. You lost your career, your reputation, your ability to even step outside without a camera in your face. And for what? Following protocol?" Carol hesitated. "People will say it's retaliation." "Let them," Richard said without hesitation. "Public opinion is fickle. Right now, they're against you, but if we control the narrative, we can shift it. People love a comeback story. They love nuance, and right now, no one's offering them any." Carol exhaled slowly, her mind racing. It was true that she had been thrown to the wolves. No one from the airline had stood by her. They had cut her loose the moment the video went viral, treating her as disposable, expendable. Maybe she was, but it still didn't sit right with her. Richard sensed her hesitation. "Look, Miss Davis, I get it. You're worried this will make things worse, but ask yourself this. How much worse can it get? They've already destroyed your life. You have nothing left to lose." That was the thing. He was right. She had nothing. No job, no savings, at least nothing that would last beyond a few months, no future. The industry she had worked in for over 2 decades had blacklisted her overnight. She couldn't even walk into a coffee shop without feeling eyes on her, hearing the whispers, the quiet judgment. She tightened her jaw. "And you think we can win?" Richard smiled for the first time since she had walked in. "I think we can make them bleed." The lawsuit was filed the next morning. It took less than an hour for the news to break. By noon, every major media outlet was covering it. Carol lifted her head. "How?" Richard exhaled. "We changed the story." She stared at him, waiting. Then he said something that made her stomach twist. "We don't just defend you, we make them question Charlie Anderson." Carol didn't know what he meant yet, but as she looked into his sharp, calculating eyes, she realized something. The real fight had just begun. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the gallery, their pens poised, their cameras ready, waiting to capture every movement, every word. The case had gone from a legal battle to a media spectacle, and Carol could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on her as she walked to her seat beside Richard O'Connor. Her lawyer sat with his usual calm, flipping through his notes as if this were just another day in court for him. Maybe it was. For Carol, it was the beginning of something she still wasn't sure she was ready for. Across the room, Charlie Anderson sat with his legal team, composed and unreadable. He had the air of a man who had been in courtrooms before, not as a defendant, but as someone in control. Carol's stomach twisted at the thought. She had once seen him as nothing more than a wealthy businessman whose presence had humiliated her, but now he was something much more formidable. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for a cause, and the public had rallied behind him. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The gavel came down once, sharp and final, and then it began. Richard rose first, his voice smooth as silk. "Your Honour, my client, Carol Davis, was wrongfully terminated, defamed in the press, and made the scapegoat of an incident that was blown far beyond reason. She did not act out of racial bias, but out of adherence to company protocol that was set by the very airline that now seeks to wash its hands of her. We are here to expose the truth, not the convenient narrative that has been fed to the media." A murmur rippled through the room, but the judge silenced it with a glance. Charlie's lead attorney, Olivia Carter, stood next. Her expression was poised, her tone steady. "Your Honour, what happened on Flight 227 was not an isolated event. It was the result of a system that has long tolerated bias, implicit or otherwise. Mr. Anderson does not seek to destroy Miss Davis, but rather to hold accountable the structures that allowed this incident to occur in the first place. The airline has its own sins to answer for, but that does not absolve Miss Davis of hers." Carol's hands tightened into fists beneath the table. "Dachin lai tenyan vat chonyat kwan." The first witness was called, Charlie Anderson himself. He took the stand with measured steps, his presence commanding but not overbearing. He was sworn in, then settled into his seat, his gaze sweeping briefly toward Carol before turning to Olivia, who approached with confidence. "Mr. Anderson, can you describe what you witnessed on Flight 27? Charlie nodded slightly. "I saw my daughters, 3 young black girls, being asked to leave their first-class seats. I saw the way they looked at the flight attendant, confused, embarrassed, like they had done something wrong, when all they had done was sit where I had placed them." "And how did that make you feel?" He exhaled slowly. "Like I was watching something that had happened to me 1,000 times before, happening to them for the first time. Like I was watching them learn, in real time, how the world would see them, no matter what I provided for them, no matter how successful I became." A heaviness settled over the room. Carol could feel it pressing down on her. She had expected him to be cold, calculating, to turn this into a battle of facts and technicalities. Instead, he had brought the weight of history into the courtroom, the kind of weight that made people listen. Richard stood. "Mr. Anderson, you are a billionaire, are you not?" Charlie's jaw tightened slightly. "Yes. You are one of the most powerful men in the airline industry, correct? I hold a significant stake in my company, yes. And you are aware that when you file a complaint, it is not treated the same way as when an average passenger does?" Charlie's lips pressed into a thin line. "I imagine that's true." Richard paced, his voice shifting, digging in. "You filed a complaint that got my client, Carol Davis, fired before she even landed, a woman who had no prior disciplinary record, who had worked in this industry for over 20 years. Tell me, Mr. Anderson, did you stop to consider the consequences of your actions?" Charlie met his gaze. "Did she?" A murmur spread through the courtroom, and for the first time, Richard hesitated. Charlie leaned forward slightly. "Did she stop to consider the consequences of her actions when she assumed my daughters didn't belong? Did she think about what that moment would do to them, about how it might shape the way they see themselves in the world?" He let the question hang in the air before continuing, his voice quieter but no less powerful. "The difference between us, Mr. O'Connor, is that I didn't act out of impulse." The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. Hidden policies of systemic discrimination were being exposed. "I didn't call for her firing," Charlie clarified, his voice steady. "I called for accountability. The airline made their decision. I simply told the truth." Richard cleared his throat, straightening. "So you're saying you had no influence over the airline's decision?" Charlie didn't blink. "I'm saying the airline was eager to make this go away. They made their choice." The tension in the room was palpable. The battle wasn't just about what had happened, it was about why it had happened, and whether Carol was merely the face of a larger problem. Before Richard could pivot, Olivia spoke. "Your Honour, I'd like to enter Exhibit B into evidence. An internal email from the airline's corporate offices, dated the day after the incident." The bailiff handed a copy to the judge and the attorneys. Carol leaned forward, her pulse hammering in her ears as she read the words, "We need to take swift action to minimize backlash. Firing Davis should be enough to shift public focus. The sooner we move, the sooner this will die down." The words blurred in her vision. Richard's jaw clenched as he turned toward the judge. "Your Honour, this email makes it clear that the airline was not acting in good faith when they terminated my client. They were acting in the interest of public perception, not justice. This is exactly what we've been arguing all along." The judge studied the document, her expression unreadable. Then she looked towards Olivia. "Miss Carter, does the defence have a response?" Olivia hesitated for the first time. "Your Honour, while the email is troubling, it does not negate the fact that Miss Davis's actions were inappropriate. It merely proves that the airline handled the aftermath poorly. The two issues are separate." Richard took a step closer to the bench. "They are not separate. They fired my client to cover for their own policies. This trial is no longer just about Miss Davis. It's about the systemic failures of the airline industry as a whole." The judge's gaze flickered between them before she leaned back in her chair. "I'll allow this into evidence. We will continue arguments in tomorrow's session." The gavel came down, and just like that, the day was over. Carol stood slowly, her mind racing. She had thought this trial would be about clearing her name, about proving she wasn't the villain the world believed her to be. But it was becoming something else entirely. It was becoming a fight that was much, much bigger than her. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Carol sat rigidly beside Richard, her fingers digging into the fabric of her skirt, eyes fixed on Olivia Carter as she strode across the floor with the confidence of someone holding a loaded gun. The prosecution had been steadily chipping away at her defense, but Carol had held firm. She hadn't done anything wrong. Not really. Not in a way that deserved this. But then Olivia turned, a folder in her hands, and Carol knew, before a single word was spoken, that something was coming. "Your Honour," Olivia said, her voice even and deliberate, "the prosecution would like to submit new evidence." A court assistant stepped forward, handing the judge a thick file. Carol's stomach twisted as the judge flipped through the pages, her brows knitting together. Then the file was passed to Richard. He skimmed the first few lines, his jaw tightening before he turned to Carol, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "They have complaints against you." The judge's gaze flickered between them before she leaned back in her chair. "I'll allow this into evidence. We will continue arguments in tomorrow's session." The gavel came down, and just like that, the day was over. Carol stood slowly, her mind racing. She had thought this trial would be about clearing her name, about proving she wasn't the villain the world believed her to be. But it was becoming something else entirely. It was becoming a fight that was much, much bigger than her. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Carol sat rigidly beside Richard, her fingers digging into the fabric of her skirt, eyes fixed on Olivia Carter as she strode across the floor with the confidence of someone holding a loaded gun. The prosecution had been steadily chipping away at her defense, but Carol had held firm. She hadn't done anything wrong, not really, not in a way that deserved this. But then Olivia turned, a folder in her hands, and Carol knew, before a single word was spoken, that something was coming. "Your Honour," Olivia said, her voice even and deliberate, "the prosecution would like to submit new evidence." A court assistant stepped forward, handing the judge a thick file. Carol's stomach twisted as the judge flipped through the pages, her brows knitting together. Then the file was passed to Richard. He skimmed the first few lines, his jaw tightening before he turned to Carol, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "They have complaints against you. This pattern," Olivia said, "demonstrates that Flight 227 was not an anomaly. It was simply the first time the world was watching." The words landed like a sledgehammer. Carol felt Richard shift beside her, radiating tension, but his voice was measured when he spoke. "Your Honor, my client cannot be held responsible for unproven accusations from years past. This trial is about a single incident, not a witch hunt against someone following airline policy." Olivia smiled slightly, the kind of smile that sent chills down Carol's spine. "Then let's talk about that policy." A new document was presented, a memo from the airline's internal communications, dated just 2 years ago. Richard barely glanced at it before pushing it toward Carol. She read the first few lines and suddenly she couldn't breathe. Effective immediately, flight attendants are advised to discreetly verify first-class passengers without drawing attention. While official policy is that all passengers should be treated equally, priority should be given to ensuring that premium clientele receive an experience consistent with their expectations. Carol's ears rang. She could barely hear as Olivia turned back to the jury. "What this memo shows, ladies and gentlemen, is that the airline created an unspoken culture, one where employees like Miss Collins were given the message that certain passengers belonged in first class more than others. This wasn't official policy, but it was understood, expected." Carol wanted to scream. She had followed orders. She had done what was implied, what was quietly expected of her, and now she was the only one paying the price. Richard rose, smoothing his expression into something calmer than Carol could fathom. "And yet, the airline fired Miss Collins without hesitation. Why?" He let the question hang in the air before continuing. "Because they needed someone to blame, someone expendable. They needed the world to believe that this was a single person's mistake, rather than an indictment of their entire system." For the first time, Charlie Anderson shifted in his seat, his brow furrowing. Richard continued, relentless. "The airline created this culture. They encouraged this behavior, and when it became inconvenient for them, when they needed to protect their brand, they threw Miss Collins under the bus." He turned, facing Charlie now. "And you helped them do it, didn't you, Mr. Anderson?" Charlie's expression hardened. Richard stepped forward. "You assumed she acted alone." The courtroom was silent. Carol watched as something shifted in Charlie's face, not doubt, but something close to it, a flicker of realization. Olivia stood, her voice steady. "Mr. Anderson isn't the one on trial here." "No," Richard agreed. "The truth is—" The gavel slammed down. The judge called for a recess. Carol barely moved as the courtroom emptied around her. Her head buzzed with the weight of everything that had just unraveled. She had walked into this trial thinking she was fighting for herself. Now, she wasn't sure what she was fighting for at all. Carol sat motionless at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. The courtroom had settled into a tense quiet after the last piece of evidence had been presented. The internal memo suggesting the airline had encouraged an unspoken culture of racial bias. But that revelation hadn't exonerated her. If anything, it had made the situation murkier. It had shifted the focus from her individual actions to something much larger, something she wasn't sure how to fight. Richard O'Connor sat beside her, calm and composed as always, but she could feel the tightness in his posture, the way his fingers tapped rhythmically against the table. He was thinking, calculating. The memo had given him a new angle, but it had also raised new risks. If the jury believed she had simply been following company culture, did that make her any less guilty? Or did it mean she had gone along with something she should have known was wrong? Across the room, Charlie Anderson sat still, his expression unreadable. But Carol had noticed something shift in him yesterday when Richard had turned the blame toward the airline, when the reality of a systemic issue had begun to emerge. Something had flickered across his face, hesitation, maybe even doubt. He wasn't backing down, but he was seeing the cracks in the story he had believed. The next witness was called, a woman in her 50s, dressed in a conservative navy suit. She made her way to the stand, her posture rigid. She took the oath, then sat, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her skirt before folding her hands neatly in her lap. "Please state your name for the record," Olivia Carter said as she approached the witness stand. "Barbara Whitman," the woman answered, her voice steady. Carol's breath caught. She recognized the name. Barbara had been a flight attendant for nearly 30 years, a senior staff member, someone everyone in the airline industry respected. If she was testifying, it wasn't by accident. "Miss Whitman, can you describe your role at the airline?" "I was a flight attendant for 28 years, Barbara said. "For the last 10, I worked primarily in first class on long-haul international flights." Olivia nodded. "And during your time in first class, did you ever notice any patterns in how passengers were treated?" A flicker of hesitation passed over Barbara's face, but she exhaled slowly and answered, "Yes." Carol felt the shift in the room. The jury members straightened slightly. Even Richard, who never looked surprised, lifted an eyebrow. Barbara continued, "There was never an official policy. No one ever told us directly to treat passengers differently, but it was understood, unspoken." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "There were passengers that we were expected to prioritize, passengers that fit the first-class image." Olivia folded her arms. "And what did that image look like?" Barbara hesitated again, then quietly said, "White, well-dressed, wealthy, familiar." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge gave a sharp glance, and the room fell silent again. Olivia paced slowly. "And what about passengers who didn't fit that image?" Barbara's lips pressed together. "We were more likely to question them, ask to see their boarding passes, double-check their seats." She swallowed hard. "I did it, and so did almost everyone else." Olivia let the words settle, watching the jury absorb them. Then she took a step closer. "Miss Whitman, did you ever personally witness Carol Collins treating passengers different based on this unspoken expectation?" Barbara hesitated, glancing briefly at Carol before answering. "Yes." Carol's stomach tightened. "In what way?" Olivia pressed. Barbara exhaled. "She followed the same patterns we all did. She was efficient, professional, but she paid closer attention to passengers who didn't fit the mold, asking them to confirm their seats, making sure they belonged." "Was she ever reprimanded for this?" Barbara shook her head. "No, because it was never explicitly against policy. It was just how things were done." Olivia nodded, then turned to the jury. "So to be clear, the airline never told its flight attendants to do this, but it was a widely understood practice?" "Yes." "And yet, when this particular incident became public, Miss Collins was fired immediately." Barbara hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." "Why?" Barbara looked down at her hands, "Because they needed someone to blame." A hush fell over the courtroom. Carol barely breathed. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she was fighting for her innocence or exposing something much bigger. Olivia let the admission linger in the air before stepping forward. "Miss Whitman, were you ever told to do this directly?" Barbara shook her head. "No, it was never spoken outright, but we all knew. It was in the way certain passengers were treated, the way complaints were handled, the way our supervisors reacted." Olivia nodded. "And did anyone ever question this pattern?" Barbara hesitated. "Not openly. If you did, you risked being seen as difficult, not a team player. And in this industry, that can mean fewer shifts, fewer promotions." Carol clenched her hands in her lap. She had known this, of course, lived it, but hearing it spoken aloud, under oath, felt like something breaking open. Olivia turned slightly. So when Carol Collins asked to see the boarding passes of 3 young black girls in first class, was she following a personal bias? Or was she following an unspoken culture enforced by the airline? Barbara's jaw tightened. Then, quietly, she said she was following the culture. A ripple of reaction moved through the courtroom. Richard leaned forward slightly, sensing a shift. Olivia stepped back. "No further questions, Your Honor." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. "Up until now, we've been playing defense, trying to prove that you weren't acting out of personal bias. But that's not enough anymore. We need to shift the focus entirely. We need to make this about the airline." She frowned. "Haven't we already? That internal memo." "That memo was a start," Richard interrupted, "but it wasn't enough. It suggested a culture of discrimination, but it didn't prove intent. We need more." Carol exhaled slowly. "And where exactly do you expect to find that?" Richard hesitated, then reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder. He slid it across the desk toward her. "A former executive from the airline reached out to me last night," he said. "They have information." Carol hesitated before picking up the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper, contact information, a name she didn't recognize. "Who is this?" she asked. Richard leaned back. "Someone who was high enough in the chain to know exactly how decisions were made. And if what they're saying is true, this case is about to change completely." A knot formed in Carol's stomach. "What do they know?" Richard exhaled. "That the airline's discriminatory practices weren't just an unspoken culture, they were policy." Carol's pulse quickened. "They were told," Richard continued, "to keep first class appealing to their most valued customers. And there were discussions off the record behind closed doors about how to do that. It wasn't about outright denying black passengers seats in first class," he explained. "It was about making them uncomfortable, making them feel out of place, encouraging flight attendants to verify their seating more often, making the experience subtly hostile so that, over time, fewer black customers would book first-class tickets." Carol felt her skin prickle. "You're saying they were trying to phase out black passengers from first class without actually saying it?" Richard nodded. "Exactly." Carol's hands tightened into fists, and I walked right into it. Richard studied her. "You weren't the only one, but you were the easiest one to sacrifice." The weight of it pressed against her chest. She had spent weeks defending silence. The audio recording played, and the courtroom was silent, except for the grainy voices of men in suits speaking in careful, calculated phrases designed to mask the cruelty of their intent. But no amount of corporate politeness could hide the reality of what they had been saying. They had engineered discrimination into the very fabric of their business model. As the final words echoed, "If a particular demographic starts feeling like first class isn't for them, they'll start self-selecting out of it." The recording cut off, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. No one moved. Even the judge seemed to be absorbing what had just been presented. Richard stood, taking advantage of the moment. He let the quiet stretch, let the weight of the words settle into the minds of the jury before he finally spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice measured and deliberate, "what you just heard wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a strategy designed to ensure that black passengers, without ever being explicitly barred, would feel like they didn't belong in first class." The audio recording played and the courtroom was silent, except for the grainy voices of men in suits speaking in careful, calculated phrases designed to mask the cruelty of their intent. But no amount of corporate politeness could hide the reality of what they had been saying. They had engineered discrimination into the very fabric of their business model. As the final words echoed, "If a particular demographic starts feeling like first class isn't for them, they'll start self-selecting out of it." The recording cut off, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. No one moved. Even the judge seemed to be absorbing what had just been presented. Richard stood, taking advantage of the moment. He let the quiet stretch, let the weight of the words settle into the minds of the jury before he finally spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice measured and deliberate, "what you just heard wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a strategy designed to ensure that black passengers, without ever being explicitly barred, would feel like they didn't belong in first class." "This recording," Olivia said, her tone cool and measured, "is disturbing. There is no denying that. But it does not change the fact that Miss Collins, in her individual capacity, made a decision on Flight 227 that reflected bias. Whether or not she was part of a larger system does not erase the harm she caused to 3 young girls who were publicly humiliated for simply sitting in the seats their father had purchased." Carol flinched. She wasn't wrong. "But let's not get distracted," Olivia continued. "This trial is not about whether the airline engaged in systemic discrimination. That is a separate issue, one that I fully expect will be investigated after today. But what happened to Mr. Anderson's daughters was not an accident. It was not a corporate decision made in a boardroom. It was a choice made in the moment by the person standing trial today." Carol's throat tightened. She felt Richard tense beside her. But before he could stand to counter Olivia's argument, something unexpected happened. Charlie Anderson rose from his seat. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, "I'd like to say something." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The judge eyed him carefully. "Mr. Anderson, if you have a statement, it should come through your attorney." Charlie didn't look at Olivia. He didn't look at anyone but the judge. "I understand that, Your Honor, but I believe what I have to say is relevant." Charlie Anderson had made a shocking decision. The judge considered him for a long moment before nodding. "Proceed, but briefly." Charlie turned, facing the jury. "When I filed my complaint against Miss Collins, I did so because I believed that my daughters had been mistreated because of their race. I still believe that, but I also believed at the time that this was the fault of one person." He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "I was wrong." A ripple of whispers spread through the room, but Charlie continued. "This recording proves what so many black travelers have known for years, that discrimination doesn't always come in the form of outright denial. Sometimes it comes in the form of a look, a tone, a small but deliberate inconvenience. It comes in the form of flight attendants being trained, subtly, implicitly, to make certain passengers feel like they don't belong." Carol swallowed hard, barely able to breathe. "I was angry," Charlie said, "and I had every right to be. But I see now that Maggie Collins wasn't the root of the problem. She was just the face of it that day. And while she should be held accountable for her actions, she should not be the only one." He turned, this time facing Olivia. "I won't stand here and say that I forgive her. I won't pretend that what happened on that flight didn't hurt my daughters, or that it didn't remind me of every time I've been made to feel like I was in a space that wasn't meant for me. But if justice is what we're after, then firing one woman and moving on isn't enough." Olivia's jaw tightened. She wasn't pleased. "Which is why," Charlie continued, "I am withdrawing my civil suit against Miss Collins and redirecting my legal efforts toward the airline itself." Carol's head snapped up. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Charlie turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I would like to formally request that the court allow my legal team to amend our lawsuit, expanding it to target the systemic discrimination that this airline has perpetuated for years. I believe today has made it clear that this issue is far bigger than one flight attendant's decision, and I believe that justice means going after the real problem." The courtroom erupted. The judge pounded her gavel for order, but the shift in the air was undeniable. This case had transformed in an instant. Carol was no longer the enemy. The airline, the very company that had thrown her to the wolves, was now the true defendant. She barely heard Richard's voice beside her. "Well," he murmured, "didn't see that coming." Carol let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For the first time since this nightmare began, she wasn't sure whether she had won or lost. But for the first time, she knew the fight wasn't just about her anymore. As Richard rose for his closing argument, the weight of the past few weeks, the testimonies, the revelations, the betrayals, all led to this moment. Carol barely breathed as she watched him straighten his tie, glance briefly at the jury, and step forward with the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly what was at stake. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice steady but not theatrical, "this trial has never been about just one flight, or one woman, or even one man's daughters. This has always been about something much bigger, about a system designed not just to serve but to exclude, about an industry that understood discrimination was bad for PR, but not bad enough to actually change its ways, until it was forced to." He let that thought settle before pacing slowly. The airline didn't fire Maggie Collins because she was the problem. They fired her because she was the solution to their problem. A quick fix, a convenient scapegoat, a way to tell the world, "See, we've handled it." As Richard rose for his closing argument, the weight of the past few weeks, the testimonies, the revelations, the betrayals, all led to this moment. Carol barely breathed as she watched him straighten his tie, glance briefly at the jury, and step forward with the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly what was at stake. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice steady but not theatrical, "this trial has never been about just one flight, or one woman, or even one man's daughters. This has always been about something much bigger, about a system designed not just to serve, but to exclude, about an industry that understood discrimination was bad for PR, but not bad enough to actually change its ways until it was forced to." He let that thought settle before pacing slowly. The airline didn't fire Maggie Collins because she was the problem. They fired her because she was the solution to their problem. A quick fix, a convenient scapegoat, a way to tell the world, "See, we've handled it." Olivia Carter stood next, her sharp heels clicking against the polished wood floor as she moved with effortless precision. She did not speak in grand pronouncements. She did not pace. She simply stood, her hands folded, and said, "We all want justice, but justice means accountability." Her voice was cool, measured, and in its own way just as powerful as Richard's had been. "We cannot dismiss the actions of individuals simply because we don't like what they say about the system they were part of," she continued. "We cannot let ourselves be so caught up in the broader issue that we forget the real harm done to real people." She turned to Charlie Anderson, who sat watching, impassive, to three little girls who sat in first class in seats their father paid for and were told they did not belong. A quiet murmur moved through the room, but she didn't acknowledge it. "You have seen the evidence, you have heard the testimony, and you must decide what justice looks like, not just for the future, but for the past." She stepped back. The judge gave the jury their instructions. Then they filed out. Time became a strange thing after that. Carol sat motionless as whispers filled the courtroom, as reporters scribbled in their notepads, as Richard reassured her in hushed tones that whatever happened, they had done everything they could. She barely heard any of it. Then the jury returned. Her pulse roared in her ears as the foreman stood, handing the verdict to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The courtroom held its collective breath as the judge unfolded the paper, her face unreadable as she scanned the words. Then she spoke. "In the matter of Maggie Collins versus the airline, we, the jury, find that the airline engaged in systemic discrimination and is liable for creating an environment that encouraged racial bias in first-class service." A collective exhale. Carol's heart pounded, but the judge wasn't finished. In the matter of the airline versus Maggie Collins, we, the jury, find that while Miss Collins was not solely responsible for the airline's discriminatory practices, her actions on Flight 227 contributed to an environment of racial bias. Silence. The words landed heavy and strange, not fully guilty, not fully innocent. The judge turned to Carol. Miss Collins, while you are not held liable in the way the airline is, this court acknowledges that your role in this incident was not without consequence. The jury believes you were acting under corporate influence, but also that you had a choice in how you enforced those expectations. She paused. That is a complicated truth, but it is still the truth. Carol felt like she had been holding her breath for days, and now, finally, she let it out. Later, when the courtroom had emptied and the cameras had moved outside, she found herself face to face with Charlie Anderson. They had not spoken directly since this all began. Now he stood before her, unreadable as ever. She swallowed. I don't know what to say. He considered her for a moment. Then don't say anything. She nodded, turning to leave, but his voice stopped her. I don't regret holding you accountable, he said, but I don't regret what happened here today either. Carol turned back. His gaze was steady, unwavering. This was never just about you, he continued, and now it doesn't have to be. She understood what he meant. Her life wouldn't go back to what it was. She would never work for an airline again. Her name would always be attached to this case, for better or worse. But the verdict had made one thing clear. She was not the only one who had to answer for what had happened. For the first time, that felt like enough. She nodded once, then she walked out of the courthouse, stepping into the cool air of an uncertain future. And for the first time in a long time, she felt free. Maggie stepped out of the courthouse, inhaling the crisp air of an uncertain future. The trial was over, but her journey was far from finished. She had walked in as a woman fighting to clear her name, and walked out as someone who had seen the system for what it truly was. What happened inside that courtroom wasn't just about her. It was about a flawed industry, an unjust culture, and the quiet, insidious ways discrimination had been allowed to thrive. Her departure wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something greater. The lawsuit had forced the world to see what so many had ignored, had made people ask questions that could no longer be brushed aside. And though her own path remained unclear, Maggie knew that the fight for justice didn't belong to just one person. It belonged to everyone willing to challenge the system. Maggie Collins's story is a powerful reminder that accountability is not just about one verdict, but about the choices we make every day. If you were in her shoes, what would you do? Would you fight back, or would you walk away? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like and share to keep the conversation going, and subscribe for more thought-provoking stories that challenge the way we see justice. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.